Namaste. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Sunita Vishwanath, one of the co-founders of Hindus for Human Rights. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that while we have been through a devastating number of years, whether it's the political and human rights situation in India or the United States, or the many devastating and ongoing wars and genocides, things just became exponentially more terrifying with the US bragging about bombing 3 nuclear sites in Iran. We pray for an end to all the wars, an end to this madness, and we will fight like hell for the living. Welcome to the fourth gathering of our Baithaks for Liberation series, an ongoing journey to imagine and embody a Hinduism rooted in love and liberation for all in our contemporary moment. Across these discussions, we have brought together scholars and practitioners to explore the ways Hindu traditions, rituals, stories, and philosophies can offer sources of solidarity, resistance, and healing, and tools to dismantle all forms of oppression. Today, in honor of Pride Month, we turn our focus to queerness. Too often, religion is weaponized against the LGBTQ plus community, and yet Hindu thought across centuries and regions have always contained visions that defy rigid binaries, ways of being that resist heteropatriarchy, honor fluidity, and make space for joy beyond heteronormativity. At a time when trans and queer people are being vilified across the globe, from legislative attacks in the US to ongoing erasures in South Asian communities, through the persistence of shame and silence, this is not just a timely conversation, it is a necessary one. Today's discussion, celebrating queerness in Hindu thought and practice, offers us a chance to forge a spiritually and culturally grounded ethic for queer liberation. An ethic that doesn't ask us to choose between our queerness and our dharma, between our politics and our faith. We are honored to be joined by visionaries at the forefront of this sacred quest, those reimagining rituals, challenging norms, and building spaces of belonging for queer and trans people within and beyond Hindu communities. Our moderator today is Dr. Gautham Reddy, who is the research librarian for South Asia and religion at Emory University. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago and has published on the intersections of religion, power, and culture in colonial South India. He serves, with me, I'm proud to say, on the advisory board of Sadhana, Coalition of Progressive Hindus, and co-led its education projects, including the Hindu Liberation Theology Reading Group for several years. He has been a beloved colleague for well over a decade in the Sisyphean work of building a liberatory Hinduism. Our Liberation Baithaks are an attempt to go deeper into dialogue and get closer to answering our core question: how do we make real in our contemporary lives a Hindu identity and way that rejects caste entirely and excludes no one? A reminder that our guests' opinions are their own and do not necessarily reflect Hindus for Human Rights positions. I will now hand it over to my dear brother Gautham, who will share opening reflections and introduce our panelists for today. Take it away, Gautham.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sunita, for inviting me into HFHR. As a queer Hindu, this is really a unique and special opportunity, and I'm honored to be a part of it. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for being here with us on a Sunday morning or afternoon, break of dawn, wherever you may be. It's truly a joy to be here with you all and celebrate this month together. As Sunita mentioned, we are in challenging days, and I know that the call to solidarity and community has never been more urgent, never felt more urgent. I wanted to begin with a few opening thoughts on community as we settle down to learn from our wonderful panelists and listen to one another. We are, we're all social beings, right? We have a fundamental need to belong. And what it means to belong may look different for each person, but that desire is an essential part of our shared human experience. For queer and trans people, whose experiences are often shaped by rejection and alienation, this need is integral to our pursuit of healing and living a whole life. My own faith has played an important role in helping me navigate feelings of rejection from family and community. I grew up in the United States, in Minnesota, in a small but active Hindu community. I have fond memories of learning Bharatanatyam, singing bhajans, weaving flower garlands for murtis, and appreciating the union and sense of community that you can feel by chanting together. Sometimes with my nanama at home, sometimes with various uncles and aunties at our local temple. When I came out, people didn't understand why I was so American or un-Hindu. And I was told this was not Indian or Hindu. Notice that the slippage that was often made too. These spaces became very difficult to be in as I was constantly questioned and silenced. And now, as an independent adult, entering these spaces has become fraught, and I don't feel welcome unless I hide who I am. Sure, I can go to the temple and I can take my private darshan, but I don't feel very welcomed in the broader community. And so much of faith is sharing about living in solidarity with one another and sharing your devotion. I have to confess that the situation hasn't changed much for me personally, but I continue to hope that we may come to a time when our different communities become more inclusive and welcoming. But this separation, the pain, was a learning experience, and it shaped for me the dream of what a just and loving community should be, or could be. And this is why I think spaces like Hindus for Human Rights, Sadhana, Desi Rainbow Families are so vital. We are actively making the world that we want to live in. We are reimagining and remaking the communities that we want to be a part of. Focusing on the divine within and without helps me personally see the deep-rooted ways we are all forever bound to one another. I set out to find and imagine my own community of faith, as I'm sure many of you have. Queer and trans Hindus are out there, and it's always a joy to meet them. I've always been drawn to history as a way of thinking about the diversity of our experiences. The world we live in is not a given. It wasn't inevitable. That's one of the main lessons from history for me. It's always been fascinating, and I know for many of you too, to learn about our queer ancestors. What queer and trans Hindus might have come before us, and how did they navigate the challenges that faced them? More importantly, what were their joys, and who were their communities? How did they live? Thinking about queer ancestors can be meaningful and help in our healing. It helps us engage the impacts of colonialism, but also nationalism, of patriarchy and caste in erasing these vital and diverse experiences. But I think it's also important for us to remember that we don't need a precedent to exist. I think oftentimes people get caught up in trying to find out uh, what was the precise way people existed in the past, and we should return to that, some kind of a golden utopian past. I don't think we necessarily need that. I think we exist because we exist. Our truth and our love is what makes our being. So with that, it's an honor to be here with two change makers who followed their truths and are actively making the world a kinder and more compassionate place for Hindus and non-Hindus, for queer people, for trans folk, and for allies, for everyone. So I'll begin with a brief introduction to our panelists, and then I will take turns asking each of them questions. And then in the last 15, 20 minutes, we'll open it up for audience questions. So please do save your questions for us. I know we're very excited to engage all of you. So our first panelist is Dr. Gopal Bhattar, who I'm also very happy to call my friend. They are an internationally recognized higher education leader, advocate, and author. Pandit Raja comes from a long lineage of Hindu scholars and is a proud queer and gender nonconforming spiritual practitioner. They hold a PhD and a Master of Arts degrees in higher education and organizational change from UCLA, and they've been featured on NPR, BBC, and numerous other media outlets. They're the author of Queering Constellations, Mapping This Journey Called Life, which was just published. So please go out and check it out. It's a really, we'll talk about it in a minute, but it's a really fascinating approach to autobiography. It's an interactive memoir of their experience as a queer Hindu Buddhist immigrant, told through letters, poetry, art, and stories. So welcome, Pandit Rajaji. And our other panelist is Aruna Rao, who is the proud parent of a queer and transgender son and the founding executive director of Desi Rainbow, which provides support, education, and advocacy for diasporic LGBTQIA+ South Asian Americans and their families. She's committed to building a world where all LGBTQIA+ identities are affirmed and celebrated, and has over 2 decades of experience in mental health advocacy and nonprofit management, and performs egalitarian Hindu rituals. So welcome, Arunaji. Before we begin, Raja, would you like to offer us a queer affirming Hindu blessing?
Sure. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. So excited to be here with both of you, two people that I call pillars in the community. So thank you for being here. Thank you for Hindus for Human Rights for organizing this space. You can put your hand on your heart for me, please. I'm going to take a couple of deep breaths and I'm going to do a couple of ohms. If you're welcome to say it with me, if you'd like, from wherever you are. I'll do a couple of prayers and I'll do some translations as well. Oh. सहना भवतु सहनौ पुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनामधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै ॐ शान्तिः 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 सर्वेषां शान्तिर्भवत् स्वस्तिर्भवतु सर्वेषां शान्तिर्भवतु सर्वेषां पूर्णं भवतु सर्वेषां मङ्गलं भवतु ॐ शान्तिः 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 श्रेयान् स्वधर्मो विगुणा परधर्मस्वनुष्ठितात् स्वधर्मे निधनां श्रेया परधर्मो भयावहः. May the divine protect us together. May the divine nourish us together. May we work conjointly with great energy. May our study be vigorous and effective. May we not mutually dispute, or may we not hate others. Let there be peace in ourselves, in our communities, and in the universe. May there be well-being for all. May there be peace in all. May there be fulfillment and self-awareness in all. May there be auspiciousness in all beings. Let there be peace in myself, in our world, in our communities. And the third mantra was from the Bhagavad Gita, one of my favorite mantras that says, may we be focused. It is more important for us to lean into our own authenticity, what we call swadharma, than what is kula dharma or others' dharma. So it's better to do our own sense of dharma imperfectly than do someone else's dharma perfectly. And so and what better words do we need than from Krishna to say what is most authentic to be fully ourselves, fully into who we are meant to be and who we are created to be, than to pretend to be something else that meets the larger global standards of identity and practices. And so with that, we welcome space. We do the Shanti so that there be peace in ourselves, in our communities, and in the universe, especially at this time, because of our fullness of our humanity and our divinity, not in spite of that, and to honor all of God's beings. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Pandit Raja. So we'll start with you first as a question. So you've had the profound honor of officiating weddings and sacred ceremonies across the country for queer, interfaith, intercaste, and couples outside the mainstream, reshaping Hindu rituals and ritual spaces so often defined by Brahminical and cis heteropatriarchal norms. Your practice honors tradition without being bound by it, crafting each ceremony through intentional conversations that balance ritual and relationship, spiritual lineage and lived truth, family customs, and chosen values. Could you share the journey that brought you into this sacred work of priesthood? What challenges, reckonings, or moments of grace have shaped your path? How do you envision the transformative power of these rituals, not only to affirm queer and marginalized identities, but to also actively resist exclusion and reimagine belonging within Hinduism?
Yeah, what a powerful question. Thank you for that. There's so much there. We could spend a couple of hours there. I just want to say I just officiated a wedding yesterday, a same-sex couple here in Vermont, where I am right now. It was my 100th wedding, which is really sweet. And just to be able to celebrate with you all feels like part of my weekend of celebration for this moment. I grew up in temples for most of my life. And so if you pick up my book, not a shameless plug, but there's a whole story in there about why I got into weddings and stuff. But really growing up at the temple, I come from about 25 generations of Hindu pandits and priests in South India, from roots in Srirangam and Tirupati, and kind of growing up in Bangalore. I was born into a family of priests, and so it was just part of, like, religion was never a question, it was just a reality. And particularly the focus on practices and rituals and the way to do things. My grandfather was one of the most staunch Orthodox people you can get, where he would yell at people at their weddings for not doing things correctly, right? And so I grew up with this idea of, like, that's what it's supposed to be. And then growing up in the US and moving to the US in the 90s, and my father is a priest and was a priest at temples across the US. And so we were in suburban Chicago at the Rama Temple in Lamont. Then we were at the Malibu Temple in California. Then we were in Connecticut at the Satyanarayana Temple, where that really was, like, for me, my own blossoming as a queer person because of the temple. And then they moved around a little bit after, but, like, just growing up at those temples, I was expected to be the good Indian kid at school, getting all the A's, and then I was supposed to be the good Indian child at the temple, where I was, like, at the temple every day after school. And so it was just like and I learned all the mantras, but I didn't know what the heck I was saying. I just knew what to do, and I knew all the rituals. And then usually around, like, when I got to middle school and teenager, I was like, why do we do this? What does that mean? What does this mean? And often the question was, well, because I told you so. And I was like, well, that seems silly. Like, these rituals that are about 5 to 10,000 years old have not have lasted this long. Had they not had something a little bit more deeper than just because someone told you so? Like, I don't think the power of word is that strong. So I became curious, and at the same time, I started to come out in my own exploring my own queerness, and felt like, we had never talked about sexuality in my family, let alone sexual queerness, and it just felt so foreign. It felt like an American thing, if you will. And so as I kind of evolved, and I became a religious studies minor in college, and really start to become one with a lot of spiritual scriptures in a very personal way as a primary document. I understood, like, there's so much diversity and so much possibility in our practices and our rituals that often gets left out in this very normativized dominant identity of the way you do things. I'm like, yes, there may be some ways that you're supposed to do things, but there's a lot of flexibility in our tradition, which is part of the beauty of it, right? And so all that to say, the reason I got to do weddings was because in 2010, I had a couple of friends of mine a friend of mine from college, this white woman from Pennsylvania who grew up in a non-denominational Christian family, was marrying her Telugu South Indian Hindu husband, and who wanted a very Hindu ceremony. And she was like, we want the Hindu ceremony, but, the two of them were like, we don't care about the rituals, one, but more so, we don't understand them, and we don't want to do things just to do them because that doesn't feel like it's aligned with how we have built our relationship. I was like, that makes sense. And so they're like, can you help us? I was like, yeah, just do this, do that, take this out. Like, this is a little sexist, maybe not do that, and, like, maybe push back on this. And she was like, we're not going to find any person that's going to do this for us. Will you just do it? And I was like, I guess I can. Why not? What's the worst that can happen? And it would end up being that, like, it was fun because I learned that once we actually got to the wedding and started planning, realized that her family, his family, who are based in Bangalore, know most of my family. And so like that somehow gave them legitimacy that like I was okay in pushing the boundaries a little bit because I came from this lineage of people that they knew, right? So that was helpful. And then a year later, I had a lesbian couple friends of mine in LA who wanted to get a Hindu Buddhist wedding, and they went to 4 temples, and the temple said, no, we don't do those types of rituals. And I was like, that's actually not true, right? The reason that we cremate our bodies when we die is because our bodies are simply a box for the soul. It's useless baggage. And so if we care so little about the body that we're willing to burn it because it's the Atman that continues to travel, and that we're married for 7 lifetimes, then it doesn't matter that what body it's in, because it's the soul has no gender, no value, no identity beyond just being pure divinity. And so that was really important to me, just to like have my own self-awareness of like really clarification on like what my values were around that. And it was very much defined by what I was taught by my family. And then really going into understanding mythology. A lot of my background was in Hindu mythology in undergrad as well, and just learning the level of queerness that exists in traditions. I was just with my sister a couple of days ago in New York, and we were by the state capitol, and there's an American flag and then the rainbow flag. And she's like, what is that? And I was like, well, that's the pride flag for LGBT people. What is that? And I was like, and she's like, oh, and then there was a whole beautiful history panel on like trans leaders in New York State, I guess. It was like, and there was like a memoir from like the 1920s or something. She was like, wow, trans people have been around that long. I was like, well, what about Krishna coming down as Mohini? Like, I was like, that's thousands of years, and that's also could be considered trans in our contemporary language, right? And she's like, oh, so it was just cool to see her brain go a little, like a little disconnect, but I think it was helpful. But I think for me to recognize that there's so many stories like that in our own practice that we would consider queer today, but at that time was just considered divine, right? And so if we are in the presence of divine, we are divine ourselves. If we say Aham Brahmasmi, then how can those queer pieces not be part of ourselves? And so that's been really important to me. In terms of the I guess the first question was what brought you here, right? And then what challenges, reckonings, and moments of grace. Thank you for the question. It's nice to read them. The challenges, I think, for me was my own insecurity, feeling like I didn't know enough to be a pundit, and to feel like maybe I didn't know, I haven't gone to the same level of schooling that my grandfather and my father have had, and yet knowing that it's also part of my in some ways my birthright. It's been part of, like, I spent about a decade of my life trying to run away from religion. Just kept coming back, and I was like, this is now how big has become part of my divine purpose in the world, is to help young people understand that our religious practices and our spiritual practices and rituals are not just something you do to do something, but it's actually a way that we live out our values in the world. And there is no need for scriptures or language or practices that can tell us there's one way to live, because we live the way there's good. It gets into our divine spirit. For me, is the intuition. If we listen to our intuition, we cannot do wrong, right? And that's part of our healing practices. The challenges has been really around families. I just a couple of weeks ago I did a wedding, and the whole Hindu side of the family didn't show up to the wedding. And to think about, this is your child, this is someone who's celebrating love, which is if we think about the 4 purposes of human marriage, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Kama, love, is one of the main pillars, and that your child is choosing that, and you're not there to celebrate that, right? Your dharma, they're living into the true sense of self, like the swadharma. Artha, they're sharing wealth and resources with someone else. They're building community. They're sharing love, and they're helping to be on a spiritual journey. So they're doing all the things that we say marriages are about, and yet you're not there to support your family. And so that's been really interesting as a challenge of like struggling to figure out how humans can do that to their own children and families. I struggle with that. And then Aruna, you and I've talked a lot about this before as well. The other challenges have been like, there's so many different ways to do Hindu ceremonies. I think Gautham, you and I talked about like, how do we create spaces, because there's so many people that want to get married, and how do we create like a template that other people can follow, so we have more people doing these rituals? The struggle is that there's so many different iterations within Hindu ways. There's maybe like one Vedic structure, but then there's literally a million ways that within a Hindu community that is Telugu versus Gujarati versus Malayali versus Sindhi can do things very differently. And so how do you understand that the breadth of these different rituals and the order and the structure there and what's critical and what's not critical. So it's been hard to figure out, like, how do you hold all that? And how do you kind of put it down to paper that feels like it makes sense? You know, even now, having done so many weddings, I learn something new at every wedding. I'm like, oh, I've never done that before. What does that mean? So I have to do a lot more work and research and to figure out, how does that fit into, is that a cultural piece? Is that a religious piece? Is that a both and or a neither? Or is that just something the family does quirkily? And so trying to understand like how that looks like just is really interesting. I've had to learn how to have some very directed questions as I work with each couple to understand what they want versus what the family's wanting. And is there a disconnect? And how do I help build the bridge and to weave all that together in a ceremony that makes sense to a Hindu and a non-Hindu audience that may or may not know what's happening. I'm thinking about, I am grateful for my own healing process of my own coming out that didn't go really well, but to be able to have incredible therapists that have been along the way and mentors and colleagues who've been able to really help me, you know, feel like I can show up in spaces as a Pandit and not feel afraid about using that title for myself, but also being able to hear from families. Even just yesterday, I had a mother come to me and say, I am so grateful that you did this for my child, because and I didn't know that this could be possible. And even the groom at one of the grooms came up to me and said, you know, I never thought as a young person this would have ever been something I could even have dreamed of. And to actually have it happen just felt really magical. And so just the recognition that marriage is an important part of our cultural identity, and to be able to hold that in this larger context of not recreating heteronormativity, but to transform even that idea of what a relationship can be, what a ritual can be, and to be able to know that you can do that in a way that allows for us to have some rituals that look the same, but really transform even the meaning and the words and the mantras that we use for them, right? Even when I do straight weddings, I do a lot of straight interfaith, interracial weddings. And I imagine like it's about every relationship is going through understanding this balance of who are we and how do we show up, and what are the values that our families have taught us? How do we celebrate those? And that's a beautiful moment, whether regardless of if you're a straight couple or a queer couple or an interracial couple, etc. And to be able to hold space for that just feels like a magical gift that I get to give myself and to the couple, and to be able to feel like the ceremony feels like it's able to reflect the values that they're literally building into the blueprint for the rest of their lives together and the 7 lifetimes together. So that's been really sweet. A lot of people, you know, there's a group of us we call ourselves the Progressive Pandit Posse. And so having people that I'm able to share and say, has anyone done a ritual like this? What does this look like? Or I can't do this ceremony. Can someone else do the ceremony? And to me, there's a community of people that are also trying to make the world better through our practices, not in spite of our practices. Well, it feels beautiful. And I think about rituals are about, I believe everything is rooted in love. If we can do something with love, it cannot be wrong. People are like, you know, I have a lot of people like, well, is this the most auspicious time for a ceremony? Is this the most auspicious day? And I'm like, you know, even Shani and Rahu and Ketu, all these gods and God that are often considered negative in our tradition, are still part of God, are still part of divinity. And so anything that you do with divinity cannot be wrong, cannot be bad. And so anything you do with love cannot be wrong. And if love is God and God is divine and God is all auspicious, then there is no bad time for God. There's no bad time for love. There's no bad time for community. And so that's really critical to the way I think about the work. And that's been really helpful to think about queerness and various marginal identities, particularly when families struggle with. I had a mother, I'll wrap up soon, I am going on, but I had a mother a couple of years in a straight wedding. She's South Asian, South Indian, Tamil, and he's white Jewish. And the mom was like, well, I want my daughter to sit on her father's lap because it's really important. I was like, well, that feels really weird. Because the daughter didn't want that. So, having the mother on this phone call, like crying and going through this like emotional moment, like, I'm going to make space for you to do that because that's important for you to grieve whatever you expected, but recognize like that has no religious context whatsoever. That's simply a cultural tradition that may or may not be relevant to the world that we live in. I don't think it is. Your daughter doesn't think it is. And so, and here you are as a woman telling your daughter who's 29 years old, wanting to pretend like she's 6 years old sitting on her father's lap. Like, it just feels weird. To be able to kind of disentangle some of that, I think has been really powerful to help give language to to couples to engage. One of the things that I do with couples that I work with, I do a download call. My first call is usually where I say, here's what a typical ceremony can look like. Here's all the questions you can ask your family. Because I'm like, because often when people ask their family, say, what do we do? They say, we do a Hindu wedding, not recognize there's a lot of different ways to do Hindu wedding. So part of my goal is to give them enough shared language and knowledge so they can ask, do we do 4 circles around the fire or 7? Do we do the Mangalasutra first or do we do the Saptapadi first? So that they're able to actually ask. So for me, the giving people agency and recognize like religion is not something that you do, but you get to actually engage and be a part of in that space.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all that, Raja. And, I think one of the things that just is very clear from what you were sharing is that, well, one, how passionate you are about like, being able to help people in this way. And we're just very grateful that, there are people like you out there. There are so few, right? So it's very special. And but the thing that became that's kind of stuck out to me listening to you this time talk about this is the tremendous social and emotional labor that you take on alongside the ritual expertise and being the pundit that's officiating. There's just so much behind the scenes work in, well, working with the couple, but really helping build bridges for the family and building an understanding among the family, and just negotiating certain challenges. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And thinking about family, Arun, I think this is a good segue to ask you a question. As a parent of a queer and transgender son, and a tireless advocate for South Asian LGBTQIA plus families, your journey is deeply personal and transformative. Could you walk us through how your experience as a parent has influenced your understanding of queerness in Hindu and South Asian cultural contexts? And how has this shaped your commitment to mental health advocacy and building affirming spaces for queer identities more broadly? We'd love to hear, any stories or insights from your journey that highlight the challenges and breakthroughs you've witnessed and how they fuel your vision for a more inclusive Hindu community. So again, a lot packed in, but whatever you feel moved to respond to.
Sure, sure. First of all, thank you, Gautham, for doing this, and to be in company today with Raja and you is just like truly an honor. Really, such a pleasure to talk about something that I don't normally talk about in terms of my own religious background and things that are happening in the community. Um, I I was raised pretty much in a very sort of, standard, I would say a standard way for most upper caste Hindus in India. I had a agnostic father and a religious mother. And so a lot of what I learned early on as a child about Hinduism was very much about sort of, building a personal relationship with your Ishtadevta and that sort of sense of, solidarity and belonging that you feel by being part of that. And I didn't, as a child, question much because it was really like, it was not a center of my life. It was just like something on the periphery. And while there was pleasuring, especially like, in ceremonial aspects, it was never something that I identified with so strongly that it felt like, I felt strongly enough to like demand change. But one of the things that really transformed my life and my understanding of my own spiritual journey, my own religious practice, was that I went through some devastating losses about 22 years ago. And those losses kind of took me along the path of trying to understand, myself in relationship to the world. I was dealing with essentially like really deep, persistent sadness, a depression that wouldn't lift. And for me, that was like essentially something that I was trying to deal with therapy, with trying to focus on meaningful work, on building community, all the things that are essentially helpful. But I could not shake off that persistent sense of loss and grief. And what really saved me at that point was finding a spiritual path. And I again re-engaged with Hindu practice, particularly with Vedanta, which is what was available at that point in my life in terms of like, teaching and gurus and things like that. And that gave my life a lot of meaning. And it really addressed that deep and pervasive sense of isolation and grief and alienation that I was dealing with. And I just wanted to offer for those of us who are dealing right now, particularly in the way that the world is, with a sense of grief and isolation. I wanted to offer just like a brief a stanza of the Bhavani Ashtakam, which is something that I find such beauty and truth and sort of a release when I read that each time. And this is just the first stanza. It's na tato na mata na bandhur na data na putro na putri na brityo na bhatta na jaya na vidya na vritar mameva gatistvam gatistvam tvameka bhavani. And in translation, that's no father, no mother, no siblings or friends, no daughters or sons, no husband or wife, no wisdom or skills that I have will protect me, but you are my refuge, you alone, Bhavani. And so that's how I came to my current understanding of Hinduism, and that has led me in my journey, both in terms of Desi Rainbow, working with the queer and trans community, and in general, propelling me forward in terms of my understanding of the world. So whether your question was about like my role as my journey as a parent and how that's informed my understanding of Hinduism and for what the community needs. So when I was raising my child, for me, based on my own experience, I wanted him to have something to turn to in terms of in times of despair. Because again, based on my own journey, it felt like this idea of engaging in practice. Unless you establish a practice which prioritizes both knowledge and devotion, confronting challenges that life throws at you is really, really hard. It can feel overwhelming. So I raised him essentially in the context of suburban New Jersey Hindu life, going to ashram, like learning in Sunday school, but always with the idea that, learn the things that will give you strength, that will build you up. And I think both my child and I found that, there is this tension between the transcendence we find sometimes in this heart-centered engagement where we're seeking something that is a personal relationship with God, and what you find in text sometimes that brings such profound relief, and community-based practice, which can feel really limited, it can feel narrow, discriminatory, casteist, and particularly for women and queer people. So what I see in my own family experience and with other families that I work with is either a complete rejection of Hinduism and just sort of an anger, a rage almost at like all the kinds of discriminatory practices that have caused so much pain and harm, or yearning for meaningful ritual and practice that allows you to celebrate milestones like the way that Raja is describing, right? To find something that really resonates with you at an important time in your life. It marks the changes and the growth and birth, marriage, death, all the things that are part of our human journey. So it makes me really, really happy to see someone like Raja leading this renaissance and kind of, offering these opportunities for our community. In terms of what has helped, I think, for many of our families is trying to reinterpret these rituals and engagements in a way that like makes sense for us. So for instance, before my son came out as trans, when he was a teenager, I had organized a mantropadesha for him. It's a way for him to declare his intent to take a spiritual journey. And while he's no longer engaged with Hinduism in any formal way, I think that has opened the door for him for his current spiritual journey. And I was really inspired by, I'm invited sometimes to things that like make such a profound impression on me. So I was invited to a namakarna, a naming ceremony by a family who had this very formal naming ceremony for their trans son. And I think he was a teenager too. He's probably 15 or 16. So they did like this really beautiful ceremony where this child essentially sat with his parents and was reborn, renamed as a trans person. And so that felt so wonderful. So I asked my son, because when he did his, he did officially, legally change his gender identity and his name. I was like, do you want to have something like that? Because it is so beautiful. I would love to see that. And he's absolutely not. He did not want a community-centered celebration. But instead, actually, that's when I reached out to Raja. Raja has been such a guide and a guru to me. I'm so grateful for your help, Raja. So basically, Raja sent me like a whole, puja, and that we could perform a Namkarana puja, which of course, is preceded by, Ganapati, Lakshmi, all of that. So it was just actually, and we did something with just us. It was the two of us, my husband and I, and my child. And we just basically did a really simple ceremony, which acknowledged, and what you were addressing, Gautham, before, it acknowledged that lineage that my child comes from. He did not appear out of like thin air. There's a queer and trans lineage that goes back eons, and he's part of that. So it acknowledged that, and it sort of consolidated our hopes and our blessings for our child's journey in this world. So those kinds of things, I think when I see them, and typically we think a lot of like this in the context of marriages, because those are the ceremonies that like really get a lot of publicity. But there are so many like different kinds of engagements that we can have with our, just the different things that are so important in our lives. And for me, I'm increasingly interested in what happens at birth and death, right? I mean, those are the things that queer people, the trans people need to have acknowledged and observed and affirmed in a way that makes sense for them. So I think these are some of the things that I see the community like wrestling with. And I think it's really important for us to like be able to create these spaces in a way that don't estrange our children, because there are many estranged children. Just like you described, Gautham, like, growing up and feeling a sense of community and solidarity, and then becoming alienated from it all because there is no space for queerness or for transness. So that's a little bit of what I've been thinking of in terms of, practice and engagement, and how our community can move forward.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing this, Aruna, and especially the very personal Nam Karuna ceremony. It's very beautiful, and maybe a model for other people that are looking for that kind of a way of celebrating with community and family. Well, I want to be mindful of time. We actually had a number of other questions too. So maybe I'll just ask one question for the both of you. Let me see. So grounded in your spiritual and activist journeys, which you've both shared just now, how can the reclamation and reimagining of Hindu rituals and narratives serve as an impetus for advancing LGBTQ plus human rights across South Asia and diaspora communities? What tangible power does this cultural spiritual work hold to challenge oppression and inspire broader movements for justice, freedom, and dignity for queer communities? It's kind of a heavy question. So.
Aruna, do you want to go first?
No, I'll let you lead.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think all movements are interconnected, right? And so I think when we start to shift one area, everything else changes significantly. And I think about that little moment I had with my sister a couple of days ago, just her recognize like queerness is not this American Western thing, but it has been part of our blood, our creation, our narratives, our stories for 10,000 years, and all these rituals. I think that is that recognition and the reaffirmation, like we have always been here, we're queer, we're here, we've always been here, and that we will be here. I think that's really important to recognize that queerness is not just Ellen DeGeneres coming out, that queerness is greater and deeper, and that queerness is not just a sexual experience. Is not just what I do with someone sexually, but like how I love, how I see the world, how I think about politics, how I think about what the world and the divinity tells me, right? In Hindu tradition, God is not just male or female. We think of it as, and most of those texts that are very gendered came much later. The earlier texts don't do as much, right? Are much more talk about the Atman and the Brahman as these very, very large, what I call my divine blobs in the sky, because like that's what it is. Like everything comes from and goes back to this divinity. So I think the reclamation of that, and I appreciate the word reclamation, because I was on a panel a while ago. They were like, does it feel like to create these rituals? I'm like, I'm not creating anything. I'm simply reclaiming what has always been mine and and I have always been there, and they has been always been within me. Um, so I think there is some power in thinking about rituals are about helping us make meaning. And meaning making is kind of been my brand for a while. Like that's what like I think a lot and think like how do we make meaning? Why do we make meaning? And where and who helps us make meaning of things? And so rituals are about that. And Hindu traditions and the ways that rituals have transformed over time is that we would not have survived as a religious and cultural practice had we not had the power to evolve and be this weird tent that's big enough to hold the most staunch atheist and the most orthodox my grandfather, and yet still be Hindu. And so to have the flexibility of that makes it both complex but also really exciting, because it's like prime space for us to be creative and engaging in that space. What tangible power does this cultural spiritual work hold to challenge oppression? I think about, I mean, when we think of trying to even think about anti-casteist movements or racism, Islamophobia, sexism, and the violence against women in our cultures. Like, it's weird to talk about, like, let's celebrate Bhavani in the morning and then go harm our women and girls at night. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. And so I think there are ways to think about, are we actually aspiring to the values that we actually say in the rituals? Or are they just mantras that just sound pretty on paper or in voice and in recording, but not actually? And so for me, it's the intentional understanding, decoding, and embracing and living of our rituals and practices what gives us the power to actually live life in ways, to truly live out Hinduism, not as a religion or a practice, but as a life way and a life path.
Yeah, no, I think Raja, you said it all. There's like one of the things that I have been thinking about is, in this context of, again, my journey has always been like from the personal to the broader community, and then to engagement with the larger world, and I think as an ally, understanding queerness, or understanding essentially the existence of queerness, has transformed my own perspective, not just on engagement with ritual, but just my understanding of the world. I will always describe it as like somebody flipped on a switch, and essentially like the room is flooded with light. So it feels like enlightenment, really, to understand that the kind of like cishet narrative that I grew up with, that kind of like sense of this is the world and that's it, there's nothing else, changed for me. So similarly, I think for those of us who are allied, who engage with the queer community or have loved ones who are queer or trans, this kind of revelation, our understanding of our loved one's journey, can be a revelation that then changes our perspective on the rest of our lives and the rest of the world, for that matter. And these kinds of, the way that Raja is describing rituals, for instance, and how they can be both grounded in, this kind of like larger Hindu narrative. They can be grounded in personal, like sort of family narratives. There's like a whole range of things that come into play. So I think like reimagining our practices with the idea of like how would it would be like what would Jesus do, is like what would what would queerness do here in this context, right? So for me, like it's been about like thinking about each aspect of things from that lens of what would be liberatory for queer people, for any kind of somebody with experiences that I don't have. And those rituals and ceremonies can then change in such beautiful and meaningful ways. Like I was thinking, for instance, I have been to, I'm sure many of the Hindus here can relate to this. I have been to Satyanarayana pujas in my community, which leave me feeling like wrung out, because when they end, there's this set of stories that are read out, the gatha that's read out, that is they're quite horrendous, most of the stories. They are like such punitive, damaging narratives. And so, what would it be like if we had a Satyanarayana Puja which essentially ended in stories that affirm and celebrate diversity and queerness and people who take these like leaps of imagination and do things that are different? So, in that context, I feel like it's important for us to like think about what are the ways that we can change these aspects of our community life. And I think that will inevitably change the way that we engage with the larger world, with politics, with just everything that we deal with in a daily way. I think that's the way that we can transform our community and engage differently.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to both of you. I wanted to invite the audience to go ahead and start putting questions into the chat, just so we can start getting a sense of what people would like to talk about. But while that's happening, I want to use my role as moderator to ask one more question. So both of you bring vital, deeply personal experiences to the work of affirming queerness in Hindu contexts. How do you each see the celebration of queer joy and sacredness within Hindu traditions and community spaces? And how is this queer joy a radical act that transforms not just individual lives, but the collective understanding of belonging and spiritual identity? In what ways can such celebration serve as a catalyst for healing and resilience within Hindu Dharma and help build a liberatory Hinduism?
You want to go first, Aruna?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Oh, that's a big question. For me, queer joy is sacred. So I don't know if it's the and is needed. I think there are queer, I mean, to be able to celebrate the divinity within us and the intuitive joy of love and knowing that love is God, right? And so that's why, I mean, when I do particularly same-sex weddings, or queer weddings, I talk about we are the queerest of the traditions because we do make space for our bodies don't matter, our body, not that they don't matter, their bodies are not defining of who we are. Our bodies are simply an element of how we navigate the world. It is our souls that define us who we are, and our souls that are connected for 7 lifetimes. And so that's really important. I do think it's radical for us to show up as ourselves, right? When I do rituals, it's pretty powerful to be like, here's a queer person with the full-on dhoti that looks very masculine with nail polish and doing my rituals in the way that feels good to me, where we are able to um, I've been really lucky to be able to understand enough Sanskrit that I've been able to change mantras to be more intentional, right? I did a wedding a couple of years ago where one of the couple identifies gender non-conforming. So instead of saying, I accept this child as my daughter, I said, I accept this child as my child, right? That's transgressive simply because a word can aligning our words with our actions, which align with our values, is the truest form of agency we can provide to ourselves and the people that we support. And for me to be able to do that in a language that is as ancient as Sanskrit and to make it accessible and intuitive and relevant today feels like we become the bridge to the past and the future. We become those queer ancestors that have come before us and after us, right? And I think what I love, what you said, Gautham, like we don't need precedent for us to exist as we are. So that existing itself is precedent making, and that feels radical. But in terms of the collective understanding of belonging and spiritual identity, thinking about what I love doing weddings because more than any other ritual, it's what brings so many South Asians together and people across cultural and social and religious and caste and class identities together, right? So to have a collective audience of 150 people that are listening to just me for an hour has a lot of power, and that's power I like, right? Because I get to actually shape a narrative, and as I narrate the ceremony and do the rituals, I'm challenging them to think different than what they've ever seen for many weddings. And then for many uncles and aunties to come up and be like, oh, that's interesting. Like yesterday, I had these uncles come up and like, I've never thought about it that way. And I was like, I love that to have 60-something-year-old people questioning what they've always thought as true, to recognize that there is no one truth is also can be expanded to be more intentional and inclusive feels pretty powerful. And then to think about the fact that for me, my queerness, I've understood the sanctity of my queerness because of my spiritual foundation. I've understood the strength of my spirituality because of my queer journey, and that those could not be dissectable for me. They're so intertwined at this point. And thinking about liberatory Hinduism. I think Hinduism at the core is liberatory if we take away all the shit that's been added over the last couple of thousands of years to it, right? It's about recognizing that we are connected to God and that and that there's one divine truth that we see in different forms, and that's okay. But the goal is for us all to heal and to become and honor our own divinity and to recognize the divinity in other people and to care for us in community, and to recognize that Asatoma Satkamaya, Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya, Mrityurma Amritangamaya. It does not say harm someone else, right? It says, may I go from untruth to illusion to truth. May I go from darkness to light and wisdom. May I go from death to immortality, not in a I want to live forever way, but in a I want to be part of, and I want to be enlightened. I want to be part of the divinity. I understand that like I have existed before birth and I will exist after death, and that everything in between is just Krishna Lila, if you will, and that those are like recognize that we are part of a larger lineage and practice, and that we are but a fleck in the larger history of divine existence, and we are one universe, right? Brahma creates universes every freaking day of his life, and so recognize that we like what I love about Hindu cosmology is that it allows us to be humble and also powerful. To recognize that we're one universe and multiple universes, multiple identity, multiple experiences, and the journey of the soul is to be, and that's it. Not even to go back or go forward, but to be and to be able to be honored and celebrated as we are. And I don't think we'd be queer if divine didn't want us to be. And so for me, and then to honor the queerness that exists just abundantly in our tradition is just. Once I realized I was like, how could I have never seen this before? Like, how did no one tell me like there's stories of like Shiva and Vishnu coming together and making Ayyappa? And I'm like, there's two men and one of them pretending to be a drag queen or a trans woman having children together, and then so they save the world that way, and then that child goes on to save a kingdom, and then that becomes a celebratory moment, right? And then also to think about there's so many unmarried people in our gods and goddesses in our tradition that also are honored and celebrated, and yet marriage becomes this really interesting touch point to create a standard of adulthood in our church. So also, like, I think even that allows us to decouple the need for coupling in our practices.
Yeah, there's no way I can like say anything that's better than that, Raja. So I think I should just leave it at that. I totally see the joy that essentially, oops, sorry. I totally see the joy that's there when marriages happen. But again, I'm looking for something beyond marriage, because I feel like marriage has become, particularly like in our communities now, has become the beginning and the end of all ceremonies, right? That's the one ceremony that everybody feels like is important and beautiful, and people will participate in. But for me, what are the other rituals in the rest of our lives? Marriage is not necessarily something that everybody is going to be performing for themselves or for others. So what are the other kinds of engagements that essentially will provide that sense of joy and belonging and affirmation? And so I'm still looking for that, and I'm looking for opportunities to do this in community rather than do it in a way that is just meaningful for myself or my family. So I think I'm that sense of like transcendence, of finding a narrative that like makes everybody feel seen just as they are. That's really like queer joy and liberation to me in the context of ceremony or ritual or celebrations. And I'm hoping to see more of that happen in the community.
I'd love to invite people to continue sharing questions in the chat. But following up, Aruna and Raja, I have a question in um, thinking about how we relate to tradition. So in diaspora, so much of our experience living in diaspora is narrated in terms of loss and kind of anxiety that we're removed from our homelands or our ancestors, the communities that have made us core to who we are. And oftentimes that can provoke a kind of clinging to this thing we call tradition, right? Tradition with a capital T. But at the same time, living in diaspora, we have a potentiality for, and as you've both been sharing already through your work and personal experience, And that's a potentiality for newness, for a kind of visionary creativity. And what I wonder is how we think about authenticity in this. Because tradition often is shorthand for authoritative or something being authentic, right? And so, what is it that we turn to that might guide our reimagination, our reclamation, as you mentioned, Raja? Um, how do we root this kind of versatility in our practice and community? Where do we look if we want to move away from the kind of this kind of staid, old-fashioned tradition with a capital T? This is the way it's always been done, and which is why it's the only way we can do it. So, yeah, any kind of reflections you might have?
Okay, Raja's waiting for me this time around. So yeah, no, I think this has been a very interesting part of like my reflections on my own journey and the community's journey. So I think immigrants, basically migrants in any context, we come with this sort of, as you said, Gautam, like this very like kind of sentimental attachment to what we left behind. And when we raise our children, particularly, we are very much doing it in the context of let them not lose what we know. So always like this fear of like, as you said, like, being authentic, being true to our traditions, being true to our culture. And what I've observed in immigrant communities is all of this becomes ossified. It's like we are frozen in time. We're in a bubble, whatever we want to call it that way. But we don't move our understanding and our reflections of these kinds of traditions in the way that, for instance, like are actively changing on the ground in places where they're actually part of everyday life. Because we have to live in this immigrant bubble where we have to separate like our traditions, culture, religion from like daily life in many ways. So we don't see that change happening. And I see this very much in terms of understanding of queerness. Like I find that when I go to Bangalore, for instance, I find like there is like kind of like um, a different narrative about queerness than I had ever believed possible when I was there as a young person, right? And whereas like in my own immigrant community here, that dialogue, that conversation does not happen because people are so convinced that this is something that does not belong in our community. So I think it's really important for us to like kind of like look at that and see what parts of our traditions, our cultures, our values, whatever we want to call them, are serving us and what is not serving us, and be quite ruthless. That's the whole thing about immigration, right? We remake ourselves, we remake our identities, we remake our lives. So we need to cut away this dead wood that is surrounding us, that's holding us back, that's holding back our children, and just find a way to claim things, parts of our tradition that serve us and that serve our kids. Because otherwise, all we're doing is damaging us ourselves, damaging our children's lives by holding on to all these like things that no longer serve us and maybe never served us. But I think that's how I view how we could move forward.
I love that, Aruna. That's so powerful. That intentionality comes through, right? Because I think one of the things about moving away from when you take a fish out of water is that it recognizes what is or is not important. So we have the ability to recreate. And often for many of us, it's particularly as our families and immigrated or emigrated either here or other ways, either by choice or force, you had to create ritual both to preserve because you felt so alone or isolated, but then also find ways to acclimate and kind of align with Sunday schools, right? Because it felt easy in a Christian-centric world to have pujas on Sundays, which doesn't make sense in a Hindu world context, but is what we do. And so there's this really interesting dichotomy almost, even though it doesn't look like it, like one is this desire for preservation, but then desire for assimilation, and that both are struggles. I remember being in Mauritius a couple of years ago, and it was right around Shivratri, and they're like, there's this pilgrimage from all across the island. People walk to this one lake because they believe that Shiva lives there. And it's like, this is kind of cool because 400 years ago, there was no Hinduism in Mauritius in this context. And yet now it's like we're not only celebrating, we've also kind of created a place and space related identity. And that's part of what human migration is about and what has been for billions of years as we've kind of navigated the world in these, like we take on the cultures of where we are. And what does it mean to engage in, I even think about temple building practices. I'm nerdy about that, right? I'm like, what material do you use for a temple where you're using fiberglass? 'Cause it's going to last better in winter, but that's not really what the scripture said. It's okay to bend rules there, but it's not going to bend rules on queerness within rituals or allowing women to be able to officiate ceremonies or be priestesses, right? So it's also interesting, what do we choose, what do we not choose, and how do these like systems of oppression and patriarchy relate into those spaces, and how do we question them? The beauty of questioning and often the asking of the why is it allows us to really understand what is the intentionality behind it, and does the behavior action understand and match that? Is it still relevant to where we were, right? The story that I'll use is not, I mean, it's, for non-meat-eaters, I'm sorry, I'm a non-meat-eater as well, I'm vegetarian, but I think it's a funny example. There's a daughter-in-law who apparently always used to cut off the legs of the turkey before she put it into the oven, and then her child at some point was like, why did it? Like, oh, because your grandma always did it. And then the grandma was like, oh, I just did it because the oven was too small, right? And so not understanding why we do something and just doing because it was supposed to be that way is actually not helpful, because you're just throwing out a part of like edible food, right? But also like in ritual, I think it's also important to say, why do we do it? It's really kind of going back to the understanding of it and the deeper, both the spiritual, but then also the practical meaning. So part of the work that I do with like weddings and stuff is like, I tell people, here's the spiritual meaning of this. Here's the historical context, which may or may not be relevant. Here's the more important like religious context. And so because once you understand all three of them, then it makes sense like, oh, that's why they did that. That's kind of cool. Like, why do you put up a curtain in the middle of the wedding ceremony? Because you'd have never seen each other before. So that made sense. But nowadays it doesn't make sense. But now it's like it's mere, the spiritual meaning is that you're still two people. So once you pull the curtain down, you become one. There's nothing, no barriers between the two of you. I mean, your love be embedded together. Like that's pretty powerful if you think spiritually, but practically it doesn't make sense, right? So to be able to help understand there's a spiritual, practical, and a religious / cultural context to each of these rituals, and that what's the word? The untying of them and the reimagining of them is actually a pretty powerful tool that our ancestors have used to create these traditions to begin with. And all this shit is made up anyway at some point or another, excuse my French. But that if we're following our heart and the intuitive spirit and the divinity within us to help guide those decisions, then we can't go wrong, if you will, or right. It's just, it becomes a new tradition, a new ritual, a new practice that's able to meet the needs of where we are as a community and make sure that the rituals and the values that we've kind of been the string between our generations is able to kind of go on to future generations.
Yeah, thank you, Aruna and Raja. So we do have a few questions from the audience, which I'd love to give some space for. One of the questions, well, there's several questions actually, which are basically, if I was to condense them, they're asking about if there are specific traditions or passages or resources that you might recommend for thinking about Hinduism and queer or trans identities. Maybe you could share ones that have been important for you.
Yeah, I can start. The chapter 3, I think it's 25, the one about Swadharma. If you just Google Bhagavad Swadharma, it'll come up. That was really important to me to think like my own ability to be true to my own sense of being who I'm supposed to be versus who other people want me to be is more important, even if I'm imperfectly myself than being perfectly someone else. I think that was really helpful. The fact, particularly when we talk about trans and cultural identities, the fact that we talk about Tritiya Prakriti in some of the earliest texts of Hinduism existing is really important. In the Rig Veda, the oldest of the 4 Vedas, the very first word is Agni, Agni Mile Purohitam. Agni is fire, being knowledge and transformation. In the same chapter, he's defined as Dvimatre, the child of 2 mothers, right? That's really important. If we think about the role that in the Mahabharata of the Pandavas living in these different roles, and one of them being Arjuna living as Napumsaka, right? As this Hijra in this community and this eunuch, and it was not a source of shame. It was simply a way to actually, it was a normal way of being, and that transness and queerness existed normally and actually part of the royal court within that space. And so there's all these different texts I think that are really important to understanding, both at a mythological level and a story level, but then also at a scriptural level, that tell us that like queerness has existed in all these different spaces. And if we think about the different forms that, particularly in the Dashavatars, that Vishnu goes through, that he molds himself to each context of where he is to protect people, which is what queerness is. I think for me, like, we queer ourselves to take up space in ways that are not supposed to be, so that we can help people, right? And we can be ourselves and be other. And so I think there's something there as well that's important to me. Oh, it's maybe the last one I'm just at is the idea that like Aham Brahmasmi, that I am divine, that there's nothing, I don't need to do anything to prove my worthiness of divinity because I am divine. Sorry, Aruna.
No worries. Yeah, no, I don't have specific texts to point to, but I do think for me, like the mythology that like essentially relates to queerness and thinking beyond the binaries really has been most important. The Ardhanarishwara, the deity with like essentially like equal aspects, both being between both binaries and being either binary is really like important to me. And I feel like that's such a beautiful concept that we can take into our daily lives. For me, the story of Shikhandi in the Mahabharata was really like such a beautiful revelatory kind of experience, because I knew about the story before my son came out, but in the context of knowing, that this character from like, this mythology like so many centuries ago, essentially describes a trans masculine person. That was just like really so beautiful to know that this is, again, speaking of this idea of lineage and of ancestors, knowing that essentially like trans and queer people did not come out of nowhere. They have always been around in every culture, every religious context. And I think just like sort of trying to look at all of the ways that we can have a non-binary or dual perspective of everything that we deal with, really to me is like the most important way to like change our perspective and change the world.
Yeah, thank you both. I think that, a number of the comments have mentioned how critical these kinds of resources and touch points are in in addressing both internalized homophobia and homonegativity, but also just working with family and community, working to unlearn these things, both individually and together. So I know that the HFHR invitation also included some resources for further reading. And there are now a number of resources as well available through Sadhana as well, if you look at their website or reach out to them. Um, so yeah, there are plenty of different levels of reading as well, from the academic to kind of a storytelling mode. Um, I think this is kind of a fascinating question that kind of touches on some of the points that you'd raised, Aruna, earlier too. This person is asking how to incorporate understandings of queerness in everyday religious life beyond marriage. So, particularly interested in how you raise children, whether or not they are part of queer families, to know a Hinduism that is expansive when it comes to sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And actually, if I can just kind of lump that question in, Aruna, if you'd like to also share a little bit about Desi Rainbow, just as an organization, and how it started and what you've all been working on.
Sure. The whole thing of like, raising a child to essentially not be like caught up in this, cis het narrative is, I think, like beyond religious practice as well. It's really all about, raising this child in a way that they understand that every part of their life does not need to be viewed from this lens, this is het lens, right? So it can be like, obviously like your engagement with language. What kind of language do you use when you're essentially describing people And not just as something as basic as pronouns, but how do you like describe like things that are not necessarily, don't have to be gendered, don't have to be in binaries. The just everyday culture that you surround yourself with, are you, for instance, like, do you have books or any kind of media around in your family that is like deals with queer and trans narratives, or just like talks about something that is not just like the norm? um, what are the ways that essentially like you have your child engage with things like in school, for instance, with like books that essentially might be dealing with LGBTQ narratives, or like narratives that deal with like different kinds of diversity? What kind of conversations can you have with elders in your family? Because to me, this is one of the most interesting things, right? I mean, I know theoretically that my child is not the only LGBTQ person in our family ever. He's the first person ever to be out, right? So in our own families, what are these narratives that we can find? So talking to grandparents, to great uncles, to great aunts about, who were these people and what kind of lives they could have led. So just finding those instances within our own traditions, our own family narratives, I think would be really, really important to raise a child in this context. And of course, the very basics. When I was a child, of course, I was taught that, women did not conduct rituals, or women, were not allowed during their period in sacred spaces. So all those kinds of things that we, were raised with, we can of course completely dispense with those practices and make sure that your child knows that these were practices that were discriminatory, casteist practices that like essentially I grew up with. All those kinds of things have to be removed completely from our daily life and our rituals. So I think those are some of the ways that we can start. We still unfortunately live in a world that does not accommodate all these narratives. So it's really important to keep reinforcing that. And with Desi Rainbow, our goal is essentially going beyond acceptance of LGBTQ identities. We are trying to build a world that celebrates LGBTQ identities, celebrates all genders, all sexualities, because they are divine. They are essentially divinely given to us, and we need to like not just consider it, something that we must tolerate, but something that we must celebrate. So, and feel free to take a look at our website, and you can learn all about the things that we're doing right now.
Raja, I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that question.
No, Aruna did a great job, except that Desi Rainbow Parents is a really cool organization, so go support them.
I think somebody is asking for links to the references. So if you RSVP'd for this event, we can send out some of the compiled references. And there's a question I think that many of us have felt, which is, how do we enter into temple spaces with a queer partner, or even just visibly queer in some way, right? And so there's a maybe very specific question that you all could offer your advice on for the larger kind of topic. But is there a gentle way, this comes from Vani Desi Botla, is there a gentle way when one goes to a temple to ask for Ashirvad for myself and my queer partner when engaging with Pandits at the temple? Is there a way to navigate that conversation? Right now, it generally feels overwhelming, so I want to ask. Thank you.
I think you just say, "Can you bless us? Here's my name. Here's this person's name." I think it's if you feel comfortable sharing your relationship, you can say, "This is my partner, my spouse, my wife, whatever," or to say, "We'd love to," when you do an archana, and say, "Here's our gotra, here's my partner," or even say, "Here's Aruna." I'm just gonna say, right, Aruna and Nakshatra. Here's my name, and just make that a normal part of it without having to feel like you have to necessarily out yourself to do that, because there's no one's going to ask you what's your relation before you do that. Like that's not part of the tradition, particularly in a South Indian temple, at least, right? So I think it's okay to just say, or even just have a list of. Sometimes I've just had people say, just have a list of names and like, can you please add all these names to the blessings? And that's totally. Or you just give them a piece of paper when you actually like get the archana ticket or whatever. You can do it that way. if you feel comfortable, I think you can also just have a one-on-one conversation before or after and say, we'd love to do a special blessing. It's our marriage anniversary or whatever it is. And then maybe do it at a one-on-one, just suss out how they will respond to that and engage with that. You'll know your priest or your temple better. If it's someone, you can also reach out to any of us and we can help you figure out if we know anything about the temple or people there. I know a lot of temples and a lot of people at the temple because they're related to me most unfortunately. And so I can tell you they don't go to this person at this temple or maybe go to this person here. You can do that at least just to get some cultural assessment there. But I think it's okay to just say we'd like blessings for our family and just leave it at that. I don't think anyone would push back, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think the point about not having to unnecessarily out yourself is a good one. I mean, you can just always just ask, you know.
I've had friends talk about like, they went to a temple and they're like, they have children. They're like, we want to do an ashram for the child. And it's like, often the priest says, well, where's the father? And like, well, this is the other partner. And so those are conversations you want to make sure you're not necessarily having in the moment, because that might not be helpful right in the middle of the ritual if you're planning something that's a larger event. So you can probably say, hey, FYI, my wife and I have children, da, 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 etc. Not even, are you comfortable? Like, this is it. This is what's happening. This is what we're doing. So I don't think you need to necessarily say, are you comfortable? Because that's not, then you're giving them space to say no. Rather than saying, we're doing this ceremony, we are the parents, here's our child, this is the ritual that we want, and to really be able to be clear about taking up space because you deserve to be in space, and that these rituals are open to you as well. And if there's pushback, then I think I would also urge that if you're comfortable taking it up at a larger conversation at the temple, or if you want to become more engaged in that level, or you say, you know what, I would even write a letter, say, here's the experience that we had, and this is why I'm not going to continue to support this temple, and this is why I make that public, and to really create some space for awareness about how people are engaging and make that I don't want to say political, but a political experience. Yeah.
Okay, and one final question. This will be for you, Raja. So for Pandit Raja, tell us about your memoir, Queering Constellations. How has creative expression and storytelling, which are so central to our Hindu traditions as we've been talking about today, how have they helped you make sense of your experience? How can storytelling help healing and transformation in our communities?
Yeah, thank you for the question and the helpful, shameless plug. I've always wanted to write a book, and I think people have said you have a really weird story, you should write it. And so it's something that I went away to a cabin, had a mini little retreat, and wrote a book in a month, and then worked on it for a year, and it's out in the world. It's a collection of short stories, personal letters to people in my life, poetry and art pieces that I've created. It's an interactive memoir because I want to blur the line between author and reader, and I want it to be a co-created story because so much of our practices, so much of our cultural vision of the world is collective, and so I wanted to be able to make this a collective storytelling, particularly as a story that's told in English, but also with some Kannada and Tamil thrown in, because of I also wanted to, and there's no glossary because I wanted you to feel what it was like for me to come to the US at 7 years old and to learn a whole new language, and I want you to figure out the context cues, etc. I want you to feel how I felt in navigating those spaces. Probably the story that's most relevant to this crowd, there's a story called New Year's Eve about me kissing this deity at the temple, and making and finding love and queerness and joy in this very sacred moment of sanctity, in this very center of sanctity. And it's storytelling, again, has been part of our tradition, part of most indigenous practices and cultures. And it's the way we have created lots of harm, is through, but we can also create liberation through storytelling. And so part of the reason I wrote the book was because, particularly with the passing of Urishi Vaid, etc., bless her soul, we don't have a lot of queer ancestors and queer leaders and authors who have stories that can give time and space that can go beyond. I can tell the story today on this panel, but in 100 years, who's going to tell our story? And to make sure that our stories are written down so that there isn't someone like me 25 years ago, in 100 years, be like, wow, I wonder if there were queer Hindu pundits before, right? I don't want that to happen. So the reason was to do that. It's called Queering Constellations. It's about constellating the stories that make meaning of our lives and give us purpose, but also to talk about how we go through trauma and how we go through healing and the ways we find liberation and joy because of our stories, not in spite of our stories. And that we get to, the constellating is that there's billions of stars in the sky, and yet we pick particular stars to say this particular star is blank Rashi or whatever it is, right? And so we give meaning because those stories, we highlight those. And so similarly, we get to, our healing practices are which stories that we are told do we elevate, and which stories of our lives do we elevate, and what stories do we let go, and what is the release, equally important to how we make sense of our own unique identity as people, and the power of, as we share stories together, we create liberation and we create community beyond time and space.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Raja. I mean, I also just want to second, it's a beautiful book. I think people should check it out. Y'all are asking for references and resources, and I think that, this is an amazing, kind of firsthand testimony of some of Raja's experiences that they've shared here with us today. And it's also just a fascinating, you wrote it in such an interesting way because it's consistently inviting the reader to reflect on what their own story is and helping you. It's a prompt for helping you learn how to tell your own story in relationship to learning about Rajaji's story. So I just, want to also urge everyone to check it out. So with that, thank you all for sharing your experiences with us. And I'd like to just pass it over to Pranay as we close out.
Yes, thank you so much to all of our panelists, to you, Gautham, for moderating this really wonderful and beautiful conversation. I think, as we're near the end of this year's Pride Month, this is like such a lovely note with so many, so many important insights to keep in mind, and just very grateful to you all for creating the space with us. To everyone who attended, thank you for joining us today. We will, of course, send out the recording of the webinar as well as a list of readings and resources later this week. So do keep an eye out in your inbox for that. If you RSVP'd, you will receive that. So keep an eye out for that. And then also I want to just, invite folks, as always, to please do consider, if you haven't already, becoming a member of Hindus for Human Rights. We have a liberation theology working group in our WhatsApp for members, where we're always having very active discussions about the topics that are raised in our Baithaks, and every month after a week or so after the Baithak itself, we have a Zoom call, a Chota Baithak, where we just come and discuss together the themes that were brought up during that month's conversation. So I'm dropping the link to join in the chat. Please do become a member if you haven't already. And yeah, thank you all so much. Happy Pride Month, everybody, and we'll see you next month.